The antique shop stood at the quiet end of Maple Street, where the road grew narrow and the houses leaned a little closer together. People passed that street every day, but very few actually entered the shop. The windows were old and slightly cloudy, and most of the objects inside were hidden in shadow. On that cold evening in late October, Daniel Carter pushed the wooden door open and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang softly. Then the sound faded into a deep, heavy silence. Daniel worked as a historical researcher for a small university archive. His job was simple. He studied old objects, documents, and forgotten pieces of art. He had spent many years around antique furniture, paintings, and strange artifacts. Because of that, he rarely felt surprised by anything he found. To him, most old things were simply part of a history. They carried stories, but never anything supernatural. Inside the shop, the air felt dry and still. Rows of shelves held dusty lamps, broken clocks, faded photographs, and small statues that had lost their color over time. The room smelled of old wood and paper that had aged for decades. Daniel moved slowly through the narrow space, occasionally stopping to examine an object. Everything looked ordinary, the kind of items that appear in small antique stores all over the country. Then his eyes stopped on a painting. It hung slightly apart from the other items, placed high on the back wall. The frame was dark and simple, nothing expensive or decorative, but the portrait inside it was impossible to ignore. It showed the face of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. The child's skin looked pale against the dark background. Thin streams of tears ran down his cheeks, frozen in the moment the artist had painted them. Daniel stepped closer without thinking. The boy's eyes were the first thing he noticed. They were large and strangely heavy with sadness. Not the kind of sadness a child might show after falling down or losing a toy. This expression felt deeper, almost as if the boy carried a grief that did not belong to someone so young. The longer Daniel looked at the painting, the stronger the feeling became. For a brief moment, the shop seemed quieter than before. Most people stop when they see that one. The voice came from somewhere behind him. Daniel turned slightly and saw the shop owner standing near the counter. The man looked old, though it was difficult to guess his exact age. His hair was thin and grey, and his face carried the tired lines of someone who had spent many years watching people come and go. "It's a strong portrait," Daniel said. "Very emotional." The old man nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the painting rather than on Daniel. "Yes," he said, quietly. "It has that effect." Daniel studied the portrait again. The brushwork was simple, almost rough in places, yet the boy's expression had been captured with unsettling precision. It was the kind of painting that stayed in your mind longer than it should. "Do you know the artist?" Daniel asked. The shop owner took a few slow steps forward. For a moment he looked like he might answer, but then he shook his head slightly. Not really," he said. "The painting has moved through many hands over the years. People buy it, and later they bring it back." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why would they do that?" The old man did not reply immediately. He simply looked at the portrait again, as if the boy inside it were part of the conversation. "Sometimes people change their minds about what they bring into their homes," he finally said. Daniel gave a small polite smile. In his work, he often heard strange explanations connected to old objects. Most of the time, those stories were simply imagination mixed with time. "How much is it?" he asked. The old man looked at him for several seconds before answering. "You really want that one?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "It's unusual. That's usually a good reason to keep something." The shop owner wrote a price on a small piece of paper and slid it across the counter. Daniel glanced at it, nodded, and paid without much hesitation. The old man wrapped the portrait carefully in thick brown paper and tied it with a thin string. When Daniel left the shop, the evening had grown darker. A layer of fog had begun to drift along the street, softening the light from the street lamps. He placed the wrapped painting gently on the back seat of his car and started the engine. For a few seconds, he sat there, adjusting the mirrors before driving. In the reflection of the rear-view mirror, the brown paper bundle rested quietly on the seat. But something about its shape made Daniel glance at it again. He could not explain why, but for a brief second, he had the strange feeling that someone was sitting behind him, watching. The feeling disappeared almost immediately. Daniel shook his head slightly and pulled the car onto the empty road. The portrait moved silently with him into the night. And somewhere behind the paper wrapping, the boy's painted eyes waited patiently for the door of a new home to open. Daniel reached home later than usual that evening. The fog outside had become thick and quiet, covering the street in a dull grey mist. The houses along the road looked distant and still, as if the entire neighborhood had already fallen asleep. When he opened the front door, the warm air inside the house felt calm and ordinary, and a small relief after the cold outside. Eleanor was sitting in the living room with a blanket around her shoulders. A lamp beside the sofa filled the room with a soft yellow light. When Daniel stepped inside, she looked from her book. "You're late today," she said. "The antique shop kept me longer than I thought," Daniel replied. He placed the wrapped painting carefully on the table. "But I found something interesting." Eleanor stood up and walked closer while Daniel slowly removed the brown paper wrapping. The paper folded away with a dry sound, and the portrait appeared in the light. The pale face of the boy looked out from the dark background, the thin painted tears still resting on his cheeks. Eleanor remained quiet for a moment. Her eyes stayed on the boy's face longer than she expected. "It's sad," she said softly, "but there's something else about it too. I can't explain." Daniel glanced at the portrait again and gave a small smile. Painters often exaggerate emotion. It makes people notice the work. Still, Eleanor continued looking at the painting. The boy's eyes seemed unusually deep, almost as if they carried a silent weight inside them. After a few seconds, she turned away, though the uneasy feeling did not fully leave her. Later that evening, Daniel hung the portrait on the wall near the staircase. From there, the painting faced the living room. The hallway lamp cast a dim light across the frame, and for a moment the boy's face looked strangely lifelike against the dark wall. The rest of the evening passed quietly. They ate dinner, spoke about small daily things, and eventually turned off the lights. The house slowly settled into silence as midnight passed. Sometime later in the night, Eleanor suddenly woke up. At first, she did not know why. The bedroom was dark and still, yet a strange uneasiness rested in the air. She listened carefully, staring toward the bedroom door. Then she heard it, a faint sound from downstairs. It was soft, almost too quiet to notice at first. A slow creaking noise, like someone stepping carefully across the wooden floor. Eleanor sat up slowly. "Daniel?" she whispered. Daniel moved slightly beside her, but didn't wake. The house fell silent again, yet the uneasy feeling remained. After several minutes, the quiet returned completely, and Eleanor finally laid down again, though sleep came slowly and restlessly. The next morning, sunlight entered the living room through the tall windows. The calm light made the house look normal again, as if the strange feeling from the night had never existed. Daniel came downstairs first. As he walked past the staircase, his step slowed. The portrait hung exactly where he had placed it the night before. Nothing around it had moved. Yet Daniel stood there for several seconds, studying the boy's face carefully. The pale skin, the dark eyes, the painted tears. Everything looked the same. And still, something about the expression felt slightly different. Daniel frowned, trying to understand why the painting now felt heavier somehow. Because now the boy no longer looked only sad. Standing there in the quiet morning light, it almost looked as if the child in the portrait had been watching the house through the night. Daniel didn't talk about the painting that morning, but the thought of it stayed in his mind longer than he expected. He tried to convince himself it was only the light. Paintings often look different depending on the time of day. Morning light can soften a face, while evening shadows can make it appear darker. It was a simple explanation, and Daniel repeated it to himself several times. Still, the uneasy feeling did not completely disappear. During breakfast, Eleanor looked tired. She sat quietly at the table, slowly stirring her tea even after the sugar had already dissolved. The kitchen was filled with soft morning light, yet her attention kept drifting toward the hallway, where the portrait hung near the staircase. "I didn't sleep well last night," she said, after a moment. Daniel looked up from his plate. "Why? What happened?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "I woke up in the middle of the night. I thought I heard someone walking downstairs. Slow steps, like someone moving through the living room." Daniel paused. For a brief second, he remembered the strange feeling he had when he looked at the portrait earlier that morning, but he quickly pushed the thought away. "It was probably the house," he said calmly. "Old buildings make noises during the night. The wood expands and shifts when the temperature changes." Eleanor nodded, though she did not look completely convinced. She finished her tea and stood up from the table, but before leaving the kitchen, she glanced once more toward the hallway. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Daniel went into his study room to continue his work, while Eleanor moved around the house, doing small daily tasks. Yet every time Daniel walked past the staircase, his eyes were drawn to the portrait again. The painting remained exactly where he had hung it. The frame had not moved. Nothing about it seemed different. And yet something about the boy's eyes made Daniel slow his steps each time he passed. In the afternoon, he finally decided to search for information about the painting. It was not unusual for antique objects to have complicated histories. Some pieces passed through many owners before anyone learned their true origin. Daniel opened his laptop and began searching. At first, the results were ordinary. Many paintings of crying children existed in his art gallery. Some were old, some were modern reproductions. None of them seemed connected to the portrait hanging in his hallway. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. For a moment, he wondered if the shop owner had simply invented a mysterious story to make the painting more interesting. Then, after scrolling further through the search results, Daniel noticed something unusual. A small newspaper article appeared among the results. The headline looked old and slightly blurred, as if it had been scanned from a very old page. Daniel opened the article. The report described a house fire that had destroyed nearly everything inside the building. Furniture, clothes, photographs, even the walls had been badly damaged by flames. But according to the firefighters who investigated the scene, one object had survived. A portrait of a crying boy. Daniel frowned slightly and continued reading. A second article appeared from several years later. Another house fire, another destroyed home. And once again, the same detail appeared. The same portrait. Unburned. Daniel slowly closed the laptop and sat still for a moment. The room felt unusually quiet now. After a while, he stood up and walked toward the hallway. The portrait was still hanging on the wall near the staircase. The pale face of the boy looked down toward the living room, the painted tears resting silently on his cheeks. Daniel studied the expression carefully. Everything about the painting looked the same, and yet the longer he stared at it, the stronger the strange feeling became. Because now the boy no longer looked only sad. Now it almost looked as if he were waiting. Daniel stayed in the hallway for a long time after reading the articles. The house felt unusually quiet now. The kind of quiet that slowly presses against the ears until even breathing sounds louder than it should. The portrait hung on the wall near the staircase exactly where he had left it. The pale boy stared out of the frame, tears painted carefully along his cheeks. Nothing had changed in the painting itself, yet something about it felt different to Daniel now. The sadness in the boy's eyes no longer felt simple. It felt deeper, almost patient, as if the portrait had been waiting for something. He returned to his study and tried to focus on work, but the information he had found online refused to leave his mind. One house fire could be an accident, two might be coincidence, but the reports he had seen mentioned several homes, all destroyed by flames, and in every case the same detail appeared in the final paragraph. A portrait of a crying boy, still hanging on the wall, untouched by the fire. Daniel kept trying to find a logical explanation for it. Maybe the material of the painting resisted heat. Maybe the frames fell in a way that protected the image. His mind searched for reasons, yet none of them fully satisfied him. Later that evening, Eleanor came into the study room. She did not speak immediately. She stood near the doorway for a moment, looking uncertain, then finally said his name quietly. Daniel. He turned his chair slightly toward her. What is it? Eleanor hesitated before answering. Can we move that painting somewhere else tomorrow? Daniel frowned. Why? She folded her arms slightly, as if she felt cold even though the room was warm. I know it sounds strange, but every time I walk past it, I feel like someone is looking at me. Not just a picture, something else. Daniel let out a small breath. Normally he would have laughed at something like that, but Eleanor did not look like she was joking. Her voice carried a real uneasiness. It's just a painting, he said gently. But if it bothers you that much, we'll take it down in the morning. Eleanor nodded slowly. She seemed relieved, though the tension in her face hadn't completely disappeared. A few seconds later, Daniel noticed something unusual. At first, it was only a faint smell drifting into the room. It was subtle enough that he almost ignored it. But then it returned again, stronger this time. Smoke! Daniel stood up immediately. Do you smell that? Eleanor nodded, her expression changing instantly. They stepped into the hallway together. The smell was clearer there, spreading slowly through the house. Daniel walked quickly toward the kitchen, expecting to find something burning near the stove, or an electrical problem near the appliances. But when he entered the kitchen, everything looked normal. The stove was off, no flames, and no smoke. Behind him, Eleanor spoke suddenly. "Daniel, look." Her voice sounded tight with fear. Daniel turned and followed her gaze toward the staircase wall. The portrait hung there exactly as before. But above it, near the ceiling, a thin stream of grey smoke was slowly rising. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The smoke was not coming from the kitchen, it was coming from upstairs. Within seconds, the smell became stronger. The air around them grew warmer, and somewhere above them, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the ceiling. "Fire," Daniel said under his breath. They ran toward the stairs. Halfway up the staircase, Daniel instinctively glanced at the portrait again. The flickering orange light from above reflected faintly on the glass. For a single moment, the boy's expression looked different. The tears were still there, but the sadness in the face had faded. Now the boy looked almost calm, almost satisfied. Another loud crack sounded above them, followed by the dull roar of spreading flames. Smoke filled the upper hallway quickly, rolling down the staircase in thick grey waves. Eleanor grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him back down the stairs. Within seconds, it became impossible to breathe inside the house. They rushed outside into the cold night air just as bright flames began to appear in the upstairs windows. Neighbors opened their doors, voices rising in confusion as the fire spread through the house. The fire trucks arrived quickly, sirens cutting through the silent street. Firefighters rushed inside while powerful streams of water struck the burning walls. Smoke filled the sky above the neighborhood as the house slowly collapsed into darkness and flame. The fire lasted for nearly an hour. By the time it was finally controlled, very little of the house remained. The roof had fallen in, and most of the rooms were destroyed completely. The next morning, the smell of ash still hung in the air. Daniel stood near the edge of the street while firefighters carefully searched through the remains of the building. The walls were blackened, furniture reduced to broken shapes of charcoal and metal. Almost everything inside the house had burned. Then one firefighter stepped out of the ruined doorway, holding something under his arm. A frame. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as the man brushed ash from the glass surface. The portrait of the crying boy looked out from the frame. The painting was untouched, not burned, not even darkened by smoke. The pale face of the boy remained exactly the same, the thin painted tears resting silently on his cheeks. Daniel stared at it without speaking. For a brief moment, the morning wind moved across the broken house behind him, and the light shifted across the surface of the glass. And in that quiet movement of light, the boy's painted eyes seemed almost alive again. Still watching, still waiting. The portrait that carried the curse had survived once more. The end